Hello, my dear friends. Today we are beginning a new set of laws. We are beginning the laws of the writing Tefillin, a Mezuzah, and a Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll. And over here we're going to be learning all about how all of that works. So it's quite a fascinating set of laws. Join along for the ride. Let us begin. So the Rambam begins off by telling us that there are a few mitzvot, a few commandments which are included over here. Number 1 is to put on Tefillin on our head. Number 2 is to put on Tefillin on our hand. Number 3 is to put a Mezuzah on our doorway. Number 4 is that if every person has to write a Torah scroll on their own. Number 5 is that the king has to write an extra Sefer Torah, an extra Torah scroll for himself. So, hold your horses. We're going to get involved. We're going to see exactly how this is done, how we write these, how we create them, and how we use them. So, number 1, the Rambam begins off by telling us that there are actually 4 passages in the Torah. There is one passage in Exodus, and then there is a second passages in Exodus as well, and then there are 2 passages of the Shema, and the other one which is V'hayayim Shamoa, which is another passage, which are in Deuteronomy. So we have 2 in Exodus, 2 in Deuteronomy. All 4 of these talk about the commandment of putting on tefillin. And these passages, these chapters are put into the tefillin, and we put them onto our hand and onto our head. And we will see exactly how we're supposed to do this, but these are the 4 portions, these 4 chapters that are inside the tefillin. Then, there are 2 portions which are actually, part of them are inside the tefillin, which are Shema and the V'hayayim Shamoa, which are the second 2 which we mentioned earlier. Those 2 are written onto a mezuzah, because when the Torah is mentioning the mitzvah of tefillin in these 2 places, it also talks about the mitzvah of putting on a mezuzah. So in tefillin there are 4 paragraphs of verses. In the mezuzah there are 2. Make sure you have that clear. Now, there are 10 things which are very important when we create tefillin. When we make them, there are 10 things to look out for, because there are 10 requirements that were passed us down from Moses, exactly how they're supposed to be. Number 1, they have to be written by ink, and they have to be written on parchment. Now, we're going to be discussing these first 2, and the other 8 are in discussion to how we put them on, and how do we tie them, etc. But that we're going to be discussing later. So right now, in this chapter, we're going to be discussing the first 2. Ink and parchment, how that works in regards to tefillin, how that works in regards to the Torah, and how that works in regard to a mezuzah. So number 1, when we're talking about ink, when we prepare the ink to write a tefillin or a mezuzah or a Torah, so there is a special procedure how this ink has to be done. So you can't just go to Walmart and go buy a pack of ink over there and start writing with it. That's not going to work. The ink has to be done in a very specific way, and it includes collecting vapor of oils, of tar, of wax, and the like, and kneading it together with sap from a tree and a drop of honey. Then it's moistened extensively and crushed until it is formed into flat cakes, dried and then stored, and eventually is going to create ink out of that. Now, the idea being, one of the points over here is that the ink has to be erasable. If it's ink which is non-erasable, it's not good, because ink should be erasable. Now, if eventually a person writes it, and for whatever reason he used ink which is not erasable, it is kosher. But essentially the way it's supposed to be done is that it is erasable. So what are we excluding over here when we're talking about ink? Especially, we're excluding red ink, green ink, even gold ink. If a person decides, I want to write my tefillin with gold ink, that's not going to be good. Now, let's talk about the parchment for a moment. In regards to parchment, so, not that I'm an animal expert, but the Rambam tells us over here a very interesting thing. When we take off the hide of an animal, and we start off by taking the hair off from the hide, and then they have a whole procedure. They put it into salt and flour and so on, and we want to make it to become very strong, and to be able to make it that it should last. So once after the person has done this, now it is called in Hebrew gvil. All right, so this is called gvil. The initial step, once you've taken off the hair of the animal, and then you've worked on it, made it into it's a type of parchment, it's a thicker parchment, that is now going to be ready to be used for writing on it. This is called gvil, and essentially the Torah is written on gvil, on this type of parchment. Now, when you have this gvil, this big, it's a thicker piece of parchment. You'll notice if you look at a Torah, it's actually a little bit thicker. You can actually split it down the middle. In other words, the thickness of it can be split into two and made into two thin pieces of parchment. We have the outer side and the inner side. Okay? So, the outer side which is where the hair was on that side. On that side, we write Tefillin on it. And the side that we write, one second. The Torah, when we use this, the gvil, we write the Torah on the side of the hair. When we write Tefillin, we write on the side of the inside of the animal. And a Mezuzah is written also on the outside. So a Torah is written on the thick piece before it's split into two, and it's written on the outside of it, on the side of where the hair used to be. Split it into two. The outside part is written the Mezuzah. The inside part is written the Tefillin. A little bit complicated, but that's the gist of it. So, now, that's officially the way it's supposed to do. If a person has done it a little bit differently, so then it's okay. In other words, if he mixed them out and used the one that's for the Mezuzah for the Tefillin, or the Tefillin for the Mezuzah, it's okay. But that's initially the way it's supposed to be. When we're talking about parchment, hide of an animal, we're supposed to be using hide of a kosher animal specifically. Even if it hasn't been slaughtered properly, in according to the laws of Shechita, which we're going to be learning later on in a few books from now in the Rambam, exactly how that works. But the idea is, even if it's a kosher animal, however it died, is going to be okay to be used to write Tefillin, Mezuzah, or a Torah on it. If it's a non-kosher animal, then we cannot use that as for this purpose. So we can't use the skin of a fish for it, even though it's a kosher fish, but because it's very oily and it's not clean, so therefore it has a foul secretion, we don't use it. And when we create it, and when we work on this hide and we make it into parchment, we have to do it with the proper thought process when we're working on it. In other words, when we make the parchment, again, you can't just go to Walmart and buy a piece of parchment if they sell it. You actually have to do it with the proper mind setting that we're doing it for a holy purpose. We're doing it in order to write a tefillin or a mezuzah on this. And therefore, we want specifically a Jew to do this, who is going to be working on it. If a non-Jew does it, we're not going to be able to use it because they don't do the mitzvah of tefillin and mezuzah and the Torah. So therefore, we specifically want a Jewish person to work it, and that's fine. When we're talking about the parchment, so it comes from an animal, but again, it doesn't necessarily have to be by killing an animal. It could be from an animal that is dead on its own, which is totally fine. We do not consume it, so therefore there should be no objections to using this. Even if someone is vegan, it's going to be okay to put on tefillin and have a mezuzah on your door. No animal was hurt in the process of creating this. Now let's talk a little bit about the writing on the parchment when we are writing a tefillin or a mezuzah and so on. So whenever we write a Torah and a mezuzah, okay, so these two, Torah and mezuzah, whenever we write, we always have to make lines, etched lines onto the parchment where we're going to be writing on. Because since these are opened up and they're being read from, we want to make sure they're going to be in a straight line. In tefillin, on the other hand, the Rambam says it's not as important to have the lines to be ruled out before we write because they are closed and put into the box of the tefillin, so therefore it is okay. and there is not necessarily a need for it. But in general, today I know that whenever Tefillin, Mezuzah, or Torah are written, they're always stenciled out, not stenciled out, but rather ruled out with lines where they are being written on. If we have a Torah scroll or a Tefillin or a Mezuzah which was written by a non-Jew, we would not use them, because only someone who is believing in this mitzvah is going to be able to write it. And has the mitzvah to do it. So a non-Jew doesn't have it. Doesn't have a mitzvah to put on tefillin. Similarly, someone who is an apostate or someone who is an apikoros, someone who does not believe in the Torah, they cannot write the tefillin, even if they want to. Because they're looking at it as a piece of art or other thoughts, and we want specifically to have the tefillin in order to serve God, and we need it to be done with that purpose in mind. So therefore, if it's written by apikoros, they actually should be burnt. If it's written by an apostate, someone who just is not keeping Torah mitzvahs, but he's not an apikoros per se, or by an non-Jew or something like that, so then we would just put them into the we bury them, we put them away, we entomb them. That's the term they use over here. If we have a non-Jew who is selling tefillin, he says that he got these from a Jew, we would believe them and we would pay for them and use them. Although, the Rambam says, we should not pay the extra worth of it, so that we should not instigate people to say, hey, I'll go steal a mezuzah, and then I'll sell it, and I'll make a lot of money, because the Jews are going to come by it and want to get it back from me. So therefore, we should not pay any extra for it from them. If we have a tefillin that was written on the hide of a non-kosher animal, or if the parchment was prepared without the proper thoughts and purpose and intent, so then it would not be acceptable. We would not be able to use it. And so, in regards to the writing of the tefillin, they also have to be done with the right intent in mind, especially when we're writing the names of God in the Torah or in the tefillin or the mezuzah. Whenever we write it, it's extremely important when we write God's name to have the full intent that right now we are writing God's name. It's not a simple matter. We are writing out God's name. So therefore, even if a king, the Jewish king, comes, we should not greet him if we're in the middle of writing God's name, because right now we're in the middle of writing out God's name. It's a very special moment. But if there's 2 or 3 names of God, we can stop in between them. But in general, we have to write God's name with the full intent. Similarly, also, when we start writing, because the ink might drip or so on, when we start writing the name of God, we should actually start from the word before and start having the feather, the quill, start to write in the words before, and then get on to the name of God. So you don't just dunk the quill into the ink and start writing God's name, but rather start from the word before and then get to God's name. Similarly, also, if a person is writing and there is not enough space on the line, the name of God should not be sticking out of the line or be stuck in between 2 lines if you forgot to write it. And in general, whenever there is a tefillin or a mezuzah, so this does not apply to a Torah scroll, but a tefillin and mezuzah, they have to be written in order. If a person writes a tefillin and he writes Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem, and then he forgets the last word, Achad. He forgets one of the words or a letter, and he moves on to the next word, and then he remembers, oh my God, oh! And when he's going over it, he realizes, I forgot a letter, I forgot a word. It's too bad. We have to bury this mezuzah. We're not able to use it, or this tefillin, because they have to be written in order specifically. A Torah, on the other hand, doesn't have to be written in order, and that's a good thing, because the Torah has 304,000 letters. So if there was even one letter missing, then the whole thing would have to be gone. That would not be fun. So the Torah is allowed to be written in different orders. You can start from the middle of the Torah and then go back to the beginning. It's totally fine. And similarly, also, when the scribes are writing the Torah, tefillin, or mezuzah, and they are now letting it, they let the ink to dry, now they're trying to keep them, they should not get full of dust or so on. They should not flip them over with the ink face down, because that's not proper honor for it. And if a person who is a scribe, and now this is, to become a scribe, it takes a lot of time, you have to study this. I actually studied this. Not that I am perfection at it, but I took a few months course to learn how to do this from a very well-trained scribe when I was back at one summer when I was in yeshiva. But when a scribe is going to write a Tefillin, Mezuzah, Torah, whatever it is, and he comes off and afterwards he says, well, when I was writing the Torah, I actually didn't have the right thoughts when I wrote God's name. So the truth is that we don't actually say that this Tefillin are going to be invalid for use. Even though if we know for a fact that it was done badly, then we say they are invalid because they need to have the proper intent. But over here, because we are going to estimate that the scribe is thinking that he's only invalidating the name of God and not invalidating the entire mezuzah or tefillin, so then we would say that it's okay. We don't believe him, or even if we do believe him, he doesn't realize the greatness of what he's trying to say, the extent of what he's trying to do. So therefore, we would say it's fine. I mean, I personally probably wouldn't use them, but the Rambam says that technically it's okay. On the other hand, someone who comes along and the person who made the parchment, and he comes along and he says, oh, when I made the parchment, I didn't have it in mind for tefillin. I was just doing it to use it as a rug or whatever. So then, because he knows that the entire parchment, now if it's bad, any of the writing will be bad on it, so therefore we say, don't use the tefillin, they're not good. When we write tefillin, they have to be written in Hebrew. That's the way they're written, and there's actually a special font in the way they're written, and there is it's a special font which has some little lines and a design on it. It's a very beautiful font, and it has to be specifically written in that font. Back in the day, they did let that the Torah scrolls should be also written in Greek letters. But the Rambam says that today we don't know exactly the way Greek letters are written, and there is confusions and disputes and so on. So therefore, we don't write any Torah scrolls in Greek, only in Hebrew. That's the only language that the Torah is written. And in general, any letter that is written has to be legible, to be able to read it and to be understood by a little child who is looking at the letter should be able to realize what letter we're talking about. If the scribe wrote a letter but it's not very clear and we can't really tell what letter it is, so then that's not good. If there is a hole in the parchment, what happens then? So if the hole was there in the beginning, before it was written, so then that's not very good. But if it's this very, very small hole, so if there's a hole, if you can write around the hole, that's fine. If you're writing over the hole, that's not good. But if it's a hole that is very small and the ink is going right over it and it's keeping whole, so then that's fine. So therefore the Rambam says we're actually allowed to use chicken or a bird parchment if we're able to create that. Even though the feathers are plucked out and now there are some tiny holes, it's okay because the ink is going to go and stick right on top of it. If there was a hole that was created in a Torah scroll or in a mezuzah later on, so if it's in the middle of a letter, in other words, it's not ruining the actual shape of the letter, you can still see it, it's complete, so then it's fine. But if it has ruined the shape of the letter, so then that's not going to be good, and it's going to invalidate the tefillin or the mezuzah or the Torah that we're using. So, my friends, this is the first chapter. It's a very fascinating topic, and we're going to be learning it over the next couple of days, all about how the mitzvah of tefillin, mezuzah, and the Torah are in Judaism, how we write them, how we use them, where, how, and when. Join along. It's going to be very fascinating. So I'm going to wish you all very well. We're going to continue, God willing, after the holiday. And so that means tomorrow there's Shabbat. There's not going to be a live video. And then Sunday night, God willing, we're going to be doing 2 in honor of the 2 days that were missed out. And maybe if I have a chance later this afternoon, I'll try to get to it, to do one of them at least. But we'll see. God willing, all the best. Have a very good one and have a happy Sukkot.